it's extremely difficult when you speak to economists to see what an oil embargo would look like in terms of inflation. How are you modeling it right now?
Well, thank you. First, it's really nice to speak to you this morning. So we're doing two things. The first one is it's an energy price shock. It's oil, it's gas for Europe, less so for the rest of the world, and it's also coal. And that we know how to model. It's a price shock, and that reduces production. The other thing we can do is actually to look sector by sector how much an economy is using of Russian gas, and we can stop that. But of course, in both cases, we're totally underestimating what the real effect would be, because with an oil or gas embargo, you could stop production in one sector, and this would have knock-on effect along the supply chain for other sectors.
So how much do you have to, I guess, review and renew your forecasts? And what's the worst case scenario right now? Are you more worried about inflation, inflationary pressures, and the specter of recession now than you were a month ago?
The longer the war will last, the more uncertainty we have, and the more worried we're getting, because as you know, uncertainty deters consumers' purchases, and it deters business investment. So yes, it is very worrying. Plus the threat of a ban or an embargo, depending on who does what, is also surrounded with really high uncertainty. We can estimate some of the things, but really we cannot estimate sector by sector. I think what one should be doing at this stage is to look at which sector would you need to switch off to preserve as much as possible a functioning economy.
So this is basically rationing. What sectors, I mean, when you look at, first of all, is it almost a given that we'll have to see some kind of rationing in Europe, and what sectors would you switch off first?
So nothing is given, because it depends on the evolution of the war. But if it lasts long for now, for a year, or depending on the behavior of Russia, yeah, it may very well happen. So you have to think a little strategically, because at the same time, as you know, we have a food crisis. So instinctively, you would think, okay, let's shut agriculture because it's using lots of energy, lots of oil, diesel, and this type of things. But at the time where the world risks a food shortage, you certainly don't want to shut down agriculture.
So I mean, it will lead to very difficult decision making. What's the longer lasting impact on food insecurity?
So it will lead to difficult decision making. At the same time, we have the experience of COVID. So we know when we shut down the sector that we can apply job retention scheme. We can help the firms while the economy is being shut down. So that's one thing. And sorry, I forgot the second question.
The second question is the longer lasting impact, I guess, on food prices or the way we consume food. Are you going to see countries or regions be much more inward looking?
That I think is a real risk. We will have consequences, longer-lasting consequences on energy security, food security, I think digital security, payment system security, trade. You're going to try and be careful with whom you're trading. And it will have long-lasting consequences in humanitarian one, in terms of refugees all over the world.
Laurence, are we underestimating these longer-term impacts? Are we underestimating the impact of this war altogether?
I really believe we're underestimating the medium-term impact of this war. I hope, I wish, and we're in the business of doing recommendation that governments actually realize that they have to focus on all these security aspects that we've been discussing. These are medium-term. They take time to address. Consolidating energy security, going with the transition will take like 3, perhaps 4 years. Food security will also take many years. It's also about transport logistics. So this is something where we should be moving away from a short-term consumer-oriented model towards a medium-term security-oriented one.
So medium-term, the biggest risk is that not companies, but countries don't do enough to support the real economy, that there's not enough fiscal spending. Like, what's the prescription today, even on oil and energy, to try and save us, I guess, the worst outcome?
So on oil and energy, it's focus on security and diversifying away, not only from fossil fuel, but also from one country, right? I mean, you don't want to move dependency from Russia to another countries, and the best way to do that is to move away from fossil fuel. While we have this type of crisis, what you want to do is to protect vulnerable people. So having means-tested, targeted measure. And if they're well targeted, well mean tested, it doesn't cost a lot fiscally. It's not always the case. And then you want also to do the same type of things for food.
Yeah.
And I think the most urgent one is the humanitarian help. We already have 4 million refugees, and we need, as soon as possible, to integrate them, to take care, medical, school, and plan.
So how much money does that mean that EU government should spend to deal with the refugee crisis?
So if you take the top of the class in terms of helping refugees to integrate in the society, which is Germany in the Syrian crisis, I mean, Turkey's done good things, Colombia as well, but in terms of really spending on language, housing, Medicare, schooling, it's about 12,500 euro per refugee. So if you have about 5 million refugees, that's something like a little less than 0.5% of EU GDP. When, as you know, the budget of the European Union is about a little more than 1% of EU GDP. It's a lot, but it's really worth it.
Yeah, and something, of course, we'll have to give. Laurence, talk to me a little bit about, currency volatility and whether there's a danger that this also scuppers plans for a lot of the governments and what central banks can do about it.
So we're going to see commodity price volatility, currency volatility. There's obviously the US central bank's very advanced in terms of tightening, but each region in the world has its own pace with its own issues. I think what's happening with the war, the consequences of the war, it's really for fiscal policy to address it, and monetary policy has to run its course, but with some caution in some regions, given that we don't really know the size of the hit and how worse it can become.